Thank you so much, Cannon, and Happy New Year to everyone. That phrase usually rolls off the tongue this time of year, but this time I really mean it. Happy New Year. It's got to be better than 2020. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Ratcliffe, whom I've known now for the better part of 15 or more years. David was the chair of the Atlanta Fed just at the time that I was being interviewed for the job. So he was one of my first contacts when I joined the Federal Reserve. He's played that role. He's played many civic roles, too many civic roles to mention. I'll just mention one or two. He's chaired the CDC Foundation Board, and of course, in his capacity now, chairs the Georgia Research Alliance Board, and many, many other things. We are very lucky in Atlanta and in Georgia to have a person of David's caliber provide so much civic leadership. His professional career, of course, was in the electric utility industry, where he was the president of Mississippi Power, Georgia Power, and ultimately the chair of the Southern Company. So let me welcome David to the screen. We'll have a bit of a slideshow and then a fireside chat. David?
Hey, Dennis, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. To say that one of the best things I ever did at the Federal Reserve was to hire you as our new CEO. So I feel like that was a really good decision on my part, on our part of the board. So thank you for that introduction, and thanks to Bill for the invitation to be with you folks today and to spend a little time talking about the Georgia Research Alliance, which is something that I feel very passionately about. So I'm happy to do that. What I'd like to do today is to take a little time and run through some slides and share a little bit about the history of the organization, then explain how the organization actually works, and then move to how do we measure our success. I always think that one of the key things to do is to be able to demonstrate a real return for the investment that's been made on behalf of the citizens of the state of Georgia in the Georgia Research Alliance. I think we can do that, and then I'll bring it home with some real-time examples of outstanding work going on in our eminent scholar group in this state today. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the history of the organization. We're actually in the process of celebrating our 30th anniversary. If you look at this next slide, you would see the first board meeting of GRA. If you look around the table, you probably can recognize some of those folks that were around the table. The GRA was born out of actually a failure to recruit a technology firm in the late 80s. Governor Joe Frank Harris asked Larry Gellerstadt Jr. to convene some business folks and discuss how we might do a better job of economic development and recruitment in this state. And Larry convened a bunch of folks, many of whom are still active in your Rotary Club, folks like Brad Curry and Bill Lingenfelter is one of the key, Charlie Ogburn, Donna Highland are current members of your club. But at the time, Jim Balloon was the McKinsey partner who actually helped Larry with the study. Larry came back and recommended that we begin something that we've called a public-private partnership between the business sector and the state, and cooperation with the universities to recruit truly outstanding research scholars to the state of Georgia. So we're into our 30th anniversary. It's been a very good model. It's grown and evolved over time. So let me explain a little bit about the model to you. So let's go to the next slide. The first thing is, and I want to emphasize this very carefully, we partner with the universities across this state to recruit scientists, and we invest in their labs. I want to emphasize the word partnership because it's not something we do by ourselves. We work with universities. I want to emphasize that we work not just with public universities, but with private universities also. And we find a scholar that we think it makes sense to recruit to the state. We put a package together with state money and then help the universities recruit those scholars and outfit their labs. Several years ago, actually about 17 years ago, then Governor Sonny Perdue augmented the capability of the Georgia Research Alliance and allowing us to actually invest in new startups around the inventions and the intellectual property that came out of these research laboratories. So we actually, in our ventures program, we actually invest in startup companies by giving them a grant or a loan to develop their proof of concept and get something up and going. And then finally, what we would do in the latter part of Governor Perdue's administration, we actually created a venture fund to go to the next level of funding for the most promising of these startup companies. So we're in the business of taking state dollars and using those state dollars in recruitment and in supporting startup ventures and moving them into the venture fund. The venture fund was actually conceived as a public-private entity also. The state put in $7 million, and then we recruited from the private sector another $37 million, so about $45 million of investment capital to use as a venture fund to facilitate the growth of these startup companies. So at a high level, that's how the model works. It's been very, very successful. So how do we think about a return for the Georgia Research Alliance? Let's go to this next slide. I think it's important for us to think in terms of money and the economic value, the return on the investment, the financial benefits. I think it's also important for us to think in terms of the workforce, the kinds of jobs that we're creating and what that means for the future employment. And I think thirdly, and certainly in my judgment, not last, is the reputational value of what GRA has delivered to this state. It has allowed the state to become much, much stronger in presenting itself as a credible, competitive state for research grants and research scholars. Let me push a little bit deeper into each one of these things. When it comes to money, we've got a lot of numbers that we can go through. Fundamentally, the Georgia Research Alliance scholars basically get and win a lot of research grants. If you look at this slide since 2009 all the way through 2020, you'd see that in the fiscal year of 2020, that number was right at $700 million of research grants that came into this state. That's a huge sum of money and a huge economic benefit to this state. Let's go to the next slide. It's important to recognize that while the GRA scholars and their teams make up about 5% of the university research workforce in the state, they generate 25% of all the funding that comes into the Georgia universities in their research programs. Let's go to the next slide. The university startups that I mentioned earlier in our venture program, since 1993, we've invested about $50 million of state money. That's money that comes through the annual legislative appropriations process that both governors in the past and the current governor today, Brian Kemp, have strongly supported the allocation of money to support not just the recruitment of scholars, but investments in these startup companies. We've invested about $50 million. When you count the amount of money that has come alongside of those investments from outside sources, it now is close to above $1.5 billion of money that's been invested in these startups. Let's go to this next slide. I mentioned earlier that the venture fund itself was a creation of the Perdue administration, and they seeded that venture fund with $7.5 million. We went out and recruited another $37 million. The companies that we have invested in from the venture fund have in addition recruited another $700 million of outside investors to their companies and their success. Let's go on to the next slide. So when you look at the financial return and you add up the amount of money that's been invested over the 30-year period of time on behalf of the state and us as taxpayers of the state, it's somewhere around $650 to $700 million over the 30 years. When we add up the return on that investment, it's around $7 billion. So I would argue that financially, the GRA has delivered on its promise to produce significant economic value for the state. When you think about all of that money coming in and being spent on salaries and resources and materials, lab equipment and things that underpin and sustain the Georgia Research Scholar Program, it's a huge return. So I think in summary, financially, the model is working very, very well. Now let's turn to the human side of the thing, or the workforce side of the thing. I think one of the most important things we do when you look at the scholar program is we've generated about 3,500 plus jobs in both the scholars and their labs and the high-tech startups that have emerged from their work. And remember, these are the kind of jobs that every state really longs for and desires as a part of their economic future and as a part of the opportunity to train a new workforce in a highly skilled fashion. So I think these numbers hopefully will continue to grow as we build out more and more companies and as we see success in that area. From a reputational standpoint, I mentioned earlier that the success of the GRA has greatly enhanced Georgia's, what we call their innovation position. That is their ability to tout ourselves as a state where there's world-class research going on. There's truly breaking edge science being done and leading edge solutions provided. If you look, you'd see one of your questions is answered right there. We're 11th in our national ranking for total university R&D. We've made significant progress. We're closing in on number 10. We hope that we move right on up that scale and get into the top 10. I think equally important on the right-hand side of this slide is these two number twos. Number two in the U.S. in the growth of science and engineering workforce. Again, as a function of the research base that we've established. And I should have mentioned, we now have about 70 plus eminent scholars. I call them eminent scholars. In my slang, I call them rocket scientists. These are people who are doing truly world-class research. That second thing, we're number two in the U.S. in the share of research supported by industry. Companies that are taking notice of our research capability and the scientists that we have and are investing their own resources in support of that research. We've got a slide that'll just show you some of those companies and some of those organizations that are involved in supporting our Eminent Scholar program and the work that they are doing. Certainly not exhaustive, but indicative of the kind of companies that are involved and the people that you would want to be supportive and could bring large sums of money to those research opportunities. So from a reputational standpoint, one of the things that I think I'm most proud of is that a great number of the scholars that we have recruited out of the 72, I think probably somewhere 10 plus, have been very actively engaged on the front line of the fight against the COVID pandemic. And have been involved in several different ways, certainly from developing promising drug treatments, testing vaccines, developing new compounds to consider, evaluating anti-inflammatory drugs, the fast evaluation of drug compounds, rapid testing, and national testing of the vaccines that have been produced. So we have lots of people, and these are pictures of some of them, who've been involved in a very tangible way in this fight and have made significant progress in that regard. I want to drill down with a couple of examples as I wrap up my thoughts here. The first is the success that we had years ago, that in 1996, we recruited a scholar to Emory named Dr. Rafi Ahmed. He was at UCLA at the time doing vaccine research. We convinced him to come to Emory and start up move all of his program to Emory. And I think the Georgia Research Alliance over several years invested about $10 million in building out that vaccine center. It has grown into the Emory Vaccine Center. In addition to that, Rafi Ahmed has been on the front line of testing the COVID vaccines that have been produced. I think the Moderna vaccine is now in the process of being tested at the Hope Clinic. Hope Clinic was a product of the vaccine center. In total, Rafi's group, I believe the number, if I look back at it, I believe in addition to Rafi himself, there are now 8 eminent scholars who are part of that Emory Vaccine Center, because we started in 1996 with a world-class scientist. We invested significant money. That has grown to a significant research capability at Emory in the Vaccine Center that is, again, on the front line of the COVID research. In addition to Rafi, about 5 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago, we worked with the University of Georgia to recruit Dr. Ted Ross from Florida, where he was doing vaccine research. He came and brought about $10 million of research with him, and has begun to work at the UGA Center for Vaccines on developing. His initial work was around developing a flu vaccine. Now he's focused a little more clearly and specifically on the COVID vaccine work. And he's been an integral part of this whole testing that is going on around the COVID pandemic work. So you take these 2 examples, and these are just 2 very high profile examples, and you look at the value of the reputation that these 2 men bring and the success that they've had and their credibility. It wouldn't surprise you to realize that the NIH in the last year has decided to invest roughly $200 million over the next several years in the vaccine research that these 2 scientists are doing in the state of Georgia. So I say all that to say the reputational value to the state of Georgia with regard to the work that is going on, in my judgment, is significant. I think it's as significant as the workforce value and the actual financial value that has been achieved through the Georgia Research Alliance over its 30 years. It's something that I'm extraordinarily proud of. I think we always need to do a better job of trying to tell the story and educate folks like yourselves who are members and active business people who can help us tell the story. You can also help us by investing in Georgia Research Alliance itself. I said that we raised state money through the appropriations process in the legislature with the strong support of the governor and legislative leadership. At the same time, we raised money in the private sector for the administrative cost of running GRA. The $1.5 million that we spend annually in actually running the organization is all private sector money. All of the state money goes to recruit those scholars and to invest in those venture companies that we talked about. So you can make an investment in GRA. We'd be happy to take a contribution from you. It's a 501c3, so there's no problem there. At the same time, you can help us tell the story as much as you possibly can. I'd encourage you to go to our website, follow us on social media. I think our folks do a very, very good job of trying to make sure that we keep our colleagues informed of current events. I know we have coming up later this week what we call our Academy of Scholars, where we get all of these scholars in a room together and we let them talk to each other. We'll do it virtually, but they will begin to share, and the collaboration that goes on there is a huge added value to this entire model. So, Dennis, I could keep rambling on, but let me stop there. And again, thank you for the time. I get excited about the work that these people are doing.
David, that was wonderful. Thanks for that overview of GRA. I want to start with a question about the state and its economic development. I've heard you say that to an extent, GRA changes the model by which we do economic development in the state. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think if you think of economic development traditionally, in most states, it's focused on trying to recruit a major corporate entity, for example, an automobile assembly plant, to the state where you've got 1,000 jobs and you've got a big manufacturing presence. And in the process, typically what we do is we put together a development package that has tax incentives in it, and we attract those industries. What I've always longed for, and I hope through the GRA model, is that we build the institutional capability in terms of research and scientific entrepreneurship, that companies look and say, because of what's going on in the state of Georgia, we have to have a presence there. And oh, by the way, you don't have to pay us to come, because we know that it's so important that we're in that ecosystem that Rafi Ahmed has created at the Emory Vaccine Center, or Ted Ross has created. We want our employees, we want our researchers, our scientists in that ecosystem. So we're going to come locate in the state so that we don't have to beg and borrow and recruit people like we've traditionally done. I hope that we can continue to attract people because of the quality of the work going on.
You presented a number of very impressive numbers. As you know, economists would look at particularly a public sector input and then try to calculate a multiplier effect in terms of the economy. And there are many dimensions of that multiplier effect beyond just direct employment, but the suppliers to the labs, the intellectual property that's spun off, the licensing fees that come from intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you give us a rough estimate of what that multiplier effect for the economy of Georgia might be? Or what would, if you were to noodle that question, what would you estimate?
You know, it's a great question, Dennis, and it's something that we probably should try to get some help doing. I don't know that we've ever tried to come up with a multiplier. One of the reasons has been I really didn't want to try to suggest a bigger number than we already had, because I thought the number we had was so impressive that, you know, a 9, 10 times multiple on your investment should be sufficient to win the day, if you would. In fact, I've made this argument to the appropriations folks at the state on many occasions that if you have a better model, then you ought to be investing in it, but you doggone sure ought to be investing in this one, because it's bringing you a 10 times, very tangible, real 10 times, not the ancillary to your question, which I think is huge. I think there's a huge fallout and ancillary benefit economically to the state.
Let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem and the culture that GRA is fostering. How would you characterize the situation of in Georgia of academics as entrepreneurs? And there are other places in the country where that kind of culture has sort of taken hold, and universities actually encourage their researchers to start companies and to spin off some of the achievements of their labs. So in terms of culture and ecosystem, where do you think we are today? It's a great question. I don't have a good scale to gauge it against. I can tell you this, that one of the original constructs of GRA was
to try to make sure that we had the business community and the academic community together, and that the business community facilitated a collaborative environment amongst the universities, which, as you know, sometimes is hard to achieve. So over our 30 years, one of the things that I'm most proud of is that the collaboration between universities doing research in this state, I think, is a role model for the rest of the country. In fact, over our history, we've had what I used to call missionary trips from other states. We actually had the governor of the state of Virginia, and he brought his entourage because he wanted to figure out, how do you do this? How does this model work? And we explained to him that it took the business community and it took the academic community working together, and then it took the scholars collaborating. Today, when we recruit a scholar, we sell strongly the idea of a collaborative working environment. Then we're able to show them very tangibly that the work between Emory University and UGA and Georgia Tech and Georgia State is a tangible reality by virtue of things like shared lab equipment. We actually have purchased lab equipment under GRA's umbrella that we can make available to different scientists across the university. That generally doesn't happen in other places. And some of the scholars that we recruited had when they came early on, said, "You told us that, we really didn't believe it existed. But now that we've been here for 2 or 3 years, we realize that the collaborative environment here is stronger than anywhere they'd been previously." So I think we have a real asset in that regard going forward.
University leadership has encouraged interdisciplinary collaboration within the confines of that particular university. And GRA is encouraging interinstitutional collaboration. I'm asking really for you to elaborate further on what you just said. Is this a secret sauce? Is this a distinctive competence that you think Georgia can actually deploy to attract people?
I don't think there's any question that it's part of the secret sauce. And again, there's no better, more credible spokespeople for that than the scholars themselves. People like Ami Klin, who runs the Marcus Autism Center. And when we recruited Ami, we sold him on the collaborative environment. I don't think he really believed that, but now he would be an advocate for that whole construct. So I think no question that it's something that's a strength, and we should try to sell it at a higher level. And I think that's important. Let me just say one other thing, Dennis. There are numerous examples that have emerged over the last 5 years where the NIH folks are looking favorably on grant applications that demonstrate collaboration between 2 different universities or 2 or 3 different universities. And we've had success there by bringing, an Emory and a Georgia Tech together for an NIH grant.
On that point, one of the more powerful tools to attract really big name scientists is dual appointments, where a scientist is, for example, gets an appointment at Emory and at Georgia Tech. Susan Margulis is a good example of that in the biomedical engineering area. Do you have some sense of how willing the universities are to consider dual appointments?
I think they're more willing by virtue of the experience and the success. And I think that's where the private sector leadership can help encourage that.
Has commercialization of the product of the labs, the intellectual property that comes out of the labs, in the academic world called translation, has that been embraced by university leadership? Where do we stand in getting that into the culture?
I say it's a mixed bag. I think every university leadership group that has a success, touts the success and is proud of it and wants more of the same. Sometimes they may not realize that they could do more to help that, but I think they're all proud of the successes and we've had some great successes.
Do you have some sense of the scientific fields that hold the most promise going forward for actually achieving a concentration of excellence here in Georgia in a particular field and for commercialization?
Well, I don't think there's any question, Dennis, that given the current reality around pandemics and COVID, that the vaccine research that has gone on for a number of years, as I indicated earlier, is beginning to pay off, and the critical mass of capability between what's going on at Emory and at UGA and others is a huge opportunity for us to grow that capability. And there's so many other things around that. The cybersecurity work that has gone on at Georgia Tech is another great example. That we launched a new program in the fall of last year that we call Greater Yield, where we're trying to bring technology research capability to just that idea, the idea of a greater yield in the ag universe that exists in this state. So we have a huge opportunity there because of the ag presence and because of UGA's capability in ag research and science. So I think those are some of the great places we ought to focus.
Let me put in a plug for neurology and brain science. In 2017, I believe McKinsey did some pro bono work for GRA where they looked at that particular area and kind of concluded that no state had really established a claim on that particular part of the healthcare spectrum, and so there's some potential there. Well, let me encourage questions from the audience before we turn it back to Cannon. So I'm looking at my private chat page here. Are there questions from Rotary members that you'd like to present to David?
Great, Dennis, thank you there. And we do have a couple questions, David, from our call it studio audience. But one is someone pointed out that there's a similar alliance initiative going on in North Carolina. And how does the GRA compare to that, and which one's having the bigger impact?
You know, that's a great question. I mean, that I'm sure they're referring to Research Triangle Park and that whole development that has emerged over many, many years up there. I'd say they got a better start. They've been at it a little longer. I don't know how they measure their success against their investment, but one of the things we tried to do was to learn from them. And, you know, one of the things that they created that we never quite were able to do is they have a real presence in a singular location in that Research Triangle Park concept, where they built the research capability geographically concentrated in a particular area. I think that has helped them significantly. I don't know whether, I suspect if you looked at their total dollars, they may be a little ahead of us.
Well, and ultimately, do we view ourselves as trying to compete with them, or is there some way that it becomes collaborative in a way as well?
I think states will always compete with each other for economic development opportunities and growth of dollars. That's just the nature of the beast. That's why I said earlier, we had a lot of missionary trips come trying to replicate the model that we've built. We were always open and shared that because we thought the universe was big enough to encourage that. So I don't see us competing. I see us being an active hunter, if you will, for new eminent scholars that we might recruit to the state of Georgia.
Certainly. We've got a couple questions that have come in. One asks, what's the role of the HBCUs in the GRA grant ecosystem?
Morehouse is on our board, as is Clark. So we've tried to make sure that they are involved in the ecosystem. They're not certainly as large as an Emory or a Georgia Tech or a UGA, but they're key players. And in fact, we're working on hopefully a new program that we can announce before too much longer that would involve one of our key players.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, well, we certainly look forward to that. And again, kind of aggregating some of the similar questions here. A couple are asking about, GRA's volume. How do we build that up, ratchet that up for maximum impact? What would be kind of a deliberate plan or path?
Well, I think the key to our future is going to be sustaining the contribution from the state. And I indicated earlier, we've had over our history, we've had strong support from governors and from legislative leadership. In some cases, it's been stronger than in others. Some governors have been more enthusiastic about it than others. If you look on average, our annual funding is somewhere around, at its peak, on average, was around $25 million. That's made up of bond money to go to equipment and actual cash to support scholars in those venture programs that I talked about. That number has gone down as the economy has been challenged over the last several years. This governor has a really good working knowledge of GRA. In fact, he helped us recruit scholars when he was in the Senate and in charge of a committee over there. So he has a passion for this. I think he'd like to have a deeper pocket than he's been given in the first couple of years of his administration. So we're hopeful that he will help us to restore the funding. And then I think when we get back to where we should be and need to be, then it's a matter of just continuing to grow that. And how do we, as Dennis suggested, where do we want to pick to make the real strong investments and provide the returns?
Wonderful answer. So maybe two more questions, if you don't mind. One, I just have, when I'm reminding and reflecting back on our programs this fall, we had Lieutenant Governor Duncan and Raphael Bostic announce their partnership for inclusive innovation to grow tech, and technology throughout Georgia and lift Georgia to one of the top, centers along the East Coast. How, and Georgia Tech's involved with that, others in the private-public partnership. How is GRA either working alongside that or in concert with that, or how do they bump up against each other?
Well, what we've tried to do is to make sure that we're actively informed of any of those kinds of initiatives. And to the extent there's a role for us to play, then we certainly want to be supportive. We want to be supportive of any research capability and any ideas of investing in new companies, either through our venture program and or our venture fund. So that's how we would come alongside and support those. Biggest thing is just to know what's going on and stay involved.
Absolutely. And maybe final question, if there are three things you have to get right in 2021 for GRA to come out and enter 2022 even better, what do you think those three things are?
Well, I think it's to stay focused on the model that has worked so well. Hopefully we'll recruit some new scholars. I know we'll continue to invest in our ventures program. Hopefully we'll have a huge success out of one of our companies in our venture fund that we can point to. We've had some, but not enough. So those would be three things that would be great.
Well, I'll tell you, you mentioned the GRA website, and I was, while you were talking, looking through it a little bit, and, you do highlight some great examples of entrepreneurial companies that, across medicine, vaccines, different research and the collaboration that you are seeing in the university system. I mean, it's amazing. Next time we're together, maybe you can describe a little bit about just some of those battle lessons. How do you get universities over the hump to collaborate, right? I mean, that's actually sounds easy. I mean, it's hard.
I think maybe we'll let them talk about that instead of us.
Pardon me?
I think maybe we invite some of them to talk about it.
Yeah.
Exactly. We might do that. But a great program. David, thank you for sharing the latest on the GRA, and Dennis, as always, thank you for your expert guidance here. Dennis, any final question or thoughts you want to wrap with?
Well, I was thinking about what a big deal it is for a scientist to move a lab. And there have to be a lot of attractions, including cost of living and education and the general living environment in the state. And David, in our negotiations with potential eminent scholars has the sort of the generally positive living environment in Atlanta and in Georgia come up?
Dennis, a great question. No, and absolutely it has. The business environment, the community environment. I can tell you that when it used to be when you recruited a scholar, you pretty much were focused on the person himself. Now you're focused on his entire family. You're focused on his entire team. And to your point, his laboratory. So all of that has to come together for a successful recruitment. And I can tell you that's where the public-private partnership, the ability to bring the business community alongside of a university recruitment to convince a scholar to pick up his lab and his team and his equipment and his family and relocate to Georgia. But once they understand the strength of the offer in its entirety, it's pretty compelling.
Great. Cannon, back to you. Is this David just presented?
Let me just mention in closing that all of those inventions in your poll came from the universities in Georgia.
That's a great point to end on too. I mean, it's rare that a multiple choice question, all of them are right. And that's, but that was 4 great examples that came out of the research system. So, well, thank you both. Great start to the year. David, best of luck through the year. And we look forward to hearing more about it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you, Dennis.